Thank you, Alex. So our next presenter is Shelby Sleevi. Shelby received her BA from Wheeling Jesuit University in 2010 and her MA from Georgetown in 2012. She's now in her fourth year of the PhD program here at Loyola in the English department, where she studies 20th and 21st century literature and narrative theory. Shelby is currently working on a dissertation that explores the legacies of literary modernism in more contemporary texts. She is also the co-manager the Loyola Community Literacy Center, a free ESL tutoring service for adults in the Chicago area. Her talk is titled, "It Was All Too Much, Too Private: Intimate Narration in George Saunders and Djuna Barnes." Welcome, Shelby.
George Saunders' debut novel, Lincoln and the Bardo, as many of its early reviewers have pointed out, is a narrative overflowing with expressions of loss and grief. Centered on the death of President Abraham Lincoln's son Willie in 1862, the novel details the events of the evening following Willie's interment in a Georgetown cemetery. Throughout the text, historical accounts of Willie's death and Lincoln's anguish are woven together with Saunders' own imaginative additions to those events, including the goings-on that occur among the cemetery's resident ghosts. These spirits, who have not yet fully grasped their departure from life, are in actuality occupants of the Bardo, a limbo-esque realm in the Buddhist tradition that exists between death and rebirth. Haunted by what they were not able to accomplish while alive, the cemetery's ghosts feared nothing more than the, quote, fire sound of the matter-light blooming phenomenon that accompanies crossing over. In the course of the novel, these restless spirits witness the grieving president's visits to his deceased son's body, and they find the tenderness of those encounters discomfiting. Quote, "It was all too much, too private, and I left that place and walked alone," admits the ghost of Hans Wollman, one of the narrative's key spectral figures, after he and several other ghosts observed President Lincoln's cradling and speaking to his son's corpse. Having been privy to this most desperate, private, and intimate of moments, Wollman must avert his attention at least momentarily, as his effective response to the scene overwhelms him. In this paper, I will focus on instances like these in Saunders' work, exploring how too private and often uncomfortable moments of intimacy within his fictions might ultimately enable intimate encounters between reader and text. The affective dimension of Saunders' narratives has been addressed frequently in the scholarship surrounding his work. Scholars have been especially keen to situate him in relation to labels such as the new sincerity and post-irony, both of which are theorized as contemporary movements that constitute breaks with the dominant modes of literary postmodernism. I do not wish to belabor those critical discussions here, as scholars such as John Doyle, Laura Morris, and Alex Millen have thoroughly examined and contested Saunders' participation in these recent literary movements. Rather, I would like to relate Saunders' narrative practices back to literature from much earlier in the 20th century, specifically to the modernism of Djuna Barnes' Nightwood. After establishing some common ground between the two authors' fictions, I will show how Barnes and Saunders enact their intimate narrations in similar ways and to potentially similar effects. Ultimately, I want to think about how these texts, separated by the better part of a century, can help us to read each other, and in doing so, explore new ways to consider and contextualize Saunders' work. As David P. Rando writes, quote, "George Saunders peoples his stories with the losers of American history, the dispossessed, the oppressed, or merely those whom history's winners have walked all over on their paths to glory, fame, or terrific wealth." Certainly, this sentiment is applicable to the characters throughout Saunders' short fiction. To take just the 2013 collection, 10th of December, as an example, there is no shortage of characters downtrodden, marginalized, and helpless. Parents like the narrator in the Semplica Girl Diaries fail perpetually to meet the economic needs of their families. Individuals such as Ted in My Chivalric Fiasco are faced with complex situational dilemmas that offer no clear or morally unambiguous solutions. And those whom society has deemed discarded, including narrator Jeff and his fellow prisoners in Escape from Spiderhead, are exploited as test subjects to serve corporate interests. Tales of disenfranchisement and dejectedness persist into the pages of Lincoln and the Bardo, not only in terms of Lincoln's own familial loss and feelings of loneliness, but in the spirit world as well, as the ghosts inhabiting the Bardo are in constant reflection over their losses and failures during life. Hans Wollman mourns having left behind a young wife with whom he was never able to enjoy, quote, "the full pleasures of the marriage bed." Roger Bevins III is plagued by remembrances of his unfulfilling life as a closeted gay man, a life that terminated in suicide. And the narrative's other ghosts include those who were addicts, enslaved persons, and victims of rape and violence while they were living. Compounding their regret and sorrow is the fact that these ghosts do not fully comprehend their current state, referring to their coffins as sick boxes, and assuming they will eventually be able to return to, make amends for, or overcome what they encountered in what they refer to as, quote, that previous place, end quote. These figures are indeed history's dispossessed, and they must relive this dispossession for the duration of their time in the Bardo. However, descriptions of Saunders' characters, like the one Rando offers above, strike me as equally applicable to the figures inhabiting Djuna Barnes' Nightwood. In an assessment reminiscent of many made by scholars of Saunders' fictions, Julie L. Abraham writes that, quote, implicit throughout Barnes' work is the sense that her texts are themselves addition to history, recording characters, experiences, and perspectives that history usually prefers to ignore, end quote. Indeed, Nightwood gives space and voice to what Jane Marcus has called a panoply of monsters, an assemblage of outcasts including Felix Volkbein the Jew, Robin Vogt and Nora Flood the lesbians, Jenny Petherbridge the squatter, and of course, Dr. Matthew O'Connor the loquacious transvestite. These misfit characters exude an air of misery, of longing, and of unfulfilled desires. They toil in vain and are compelled to discuss their losses obsessively. For Felix, Nora, and Jenny, the occasion for this loss is Robin Vogt, a woman loved by each of them, but who ultimately left them all behind. In addition to the loss of Robin, however, Victoria L. Smith writes that there is also something more elusive and less recognizable lost to Nightwood's characters. Smith writes, quote, the narrative shapes itself around a blank space, an absence that outlines a loss of access to history, to language, and to representation in general for those consigned to the margins because of their gender, sexuality, religion, or color, an awful fate indeed. The complexity, even opacity of Barnes' writings, its indirectness, its sustained use of tropes, enables us to see these outlines, the shadows, the psyches of those people, particularly Jews, lesbians, and male homosexuals, that have been previously unremarked, unspoken, and unaccounted for, end quote. I will return to the ways in which language operates in Nightwood momentarily, but Smith's description of this pervasive atmosphere of loss provides an interesting opportunity for comparison with Saunders' Lincoln in the Bardo. Although Nightwood's characters are still living, they share a posture of despondency with Bardo's departed souls, providing only shadowy impressions of themselves through their protracted meditations on what they long for but cannot have. It is perhaps this very shadow-like quality that led one contemporary reviewer of Nightwood to remark, its people are ghosts. When the doctor explains to Nora that the individuals of queer sexuality have committed, quote, the unpardonable error of not being able to exist, end quote, we might consider how this sentiment maps onto an understanding of the text characters as ghostly, more shadow than presence in relation to the dominant culture that makes them marginal. In other words, Nightwood's characters seem to exist in a Bardo of their own. In a longer project, I offer more extended meditations on the similarities between Barnes and Saunders' works, including their carnivalesque incorporations of the abject and the obscene, their playful yet not entirely irreverent uses of humor, and their methods of challenging the records of official history. In what remains of this short presentation, however, I want to focus on the many vulnerable and earnest expressions of feeling found in both Nightwood and Lincoln in the Bardo, expressions that, when taken together, result in instances of particularly intimate narration. In terms of narrative structure, both texts are characterized by an immense amount of dialogue, to the extent that, in both cases, speech significantly outweighs action. A telling illustration of this ratio in Nightwood involves the separation of Robin and Nora. The breakup itself is described in fewer than 2 lines, but Nora's conversations with Dr. O'Connor about the breakup span nearly 2 chapters. What's more, the profusion of dialogue that flows through Nightwood does little to move the narrative's progression forward. As the doctor famously remarks to an inconsolable Nora, I have a narrative, but you will be put to find it. The doctor is especially inclined toward protracted and meandering speeches in what Smith refers to as, quote, a series of swerves away from plot, convention, and received meanings, end quote. Both Laura Veltman and Deborah Parsons have written on the ways in which Nightwood evokes the ritual of confession through these prolonged dialogues with Dr. O'Connor. As Parsons explains, the novel is filled with the obsessive and, quote, desperate confession of sin and shame, end quote, though engaging in these intimate dialogues does little to alleviate the character's suffering. To borrow Ernst van Alphen's incisive assessment of these exchanges, quote, "The doctor holds prophetic monologues in which their despair is not softened, but, on the contrary, mirrored and aggrandized in a theatrical way." In Lincoln in the Bardo, character dialogue gains even more control over the narrative structure, as there is no outside narrator present to curate their conversations. Rather, the novel reads as a chorus of character voices that find themselves fighting over one another to be heard. In her review of the novel, Michiko Kakutani notes this cacophonous quality, writing that the supernatural chatter can grow tedious at times, and thus the novel would have benefited from some judicious pruning. However, what this critique misses is how the noisy proliferation of dialogue might function as a necessary excess in Bardo, and it is here that I think the model of Knightwood can help us to better read Saunders' narrative. As the ghost of Roger Bevins III explains, in order to remain in the transitional state that is the Bardo, quote, "One must deeply and continuously dwell upon one's primary reason for staying, even to the exclusion of all else," end quote. To this, Hans Wollmann adds, "One must be constantly looking for opportunities to tell one's story." When the ghost of Willie Lincoln confronts Wollmann and Bevins with his newly realized truth that they are all dead, 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 the spirits reply with the same comforting logic they have relied on for years. As Bevins relates, "Now look," Mr. Wollmann said to the boy, "you are wrong. If what you say is true, who is it that is saying it?" "Who is hearing it?" I said. "Who is speaking to you now?" said Mr. Wollmann. "To whom do we speak?" I said. End quote. As long as the spirits continue speaking, as long as they can articulate their stories to whomever is there to hear, they are able to assert their presence, if only to themselves and each other. As in Knightwood, then, the continued speech enabled by the obsessive repetition of one's most private and painful story seems to be the condition on which existence in the Bardo is predicated. Scholars of Knightwood have written extensively on the melancholic aspects of this novel, in terms of both character psychology and as a way to understand the text's larger narrative form. As Catherine A. Fama explains, quote, "A warped form of mourning, melancholia demands compulsive repetition while facilitating alternate forms of knowing and telling," end quote. She goes on, "The melancholic's compulsion to repeat highlights narrative desires to retell and be told, the shared desire for stable, imposed meaning. Melancholia parallels and bucks the timing, progression, and authority of teleological narrative. It disrupts narrative reception, prompting the reader's textual awareness and the visibility of desire and drives," end quote. Melancholia is thus a valid and helpful framework for understanding the multiplicity of highly intimate and often discomforting narrations found within Knightwood. Having failed or refused to mourn their losses successfully, Barnes' characters are suspended in the limbo of their frustrated desires. Here, the comparison to Bardo is obvious, although the trajectories of the novels in this respect depart significantly from one another as they each move toward completion. And this is a point I will not belabor or linger over, since presumably some of you have not read or finished that novel, and I would not want to ruin that for you. However, instead of focusing on how the text characters do or do not overcome their melancholic tendencies on the level of plot, I want to end by shifting the focus outward and suggest that both texts invite a similar kind of affective participation from their readers. In an account of his own affective responses while reading Knightwood, Van Alphen writes that Barnes' text requires us to engage in, quote, "a different way of relating to a cultural object than we are normally accustomed to. Instead of identifying the object, grasping it, pinning it down, or absorbing it in our understanding," he writes, "effective reading establishes a relationship by touching the cultural object, and this touching enables a way of taking part in its culture in the strongest possible sense," end quote. To embrace Barnes and Saunders' novels in this more tactile and tender way, we must allow ourselves to feel with their story worlds, to listen to and thus legitimate their characters' too private thoughts and desperate confessions without turning away. However, I hesitate to agree with Leni Nieper when she writes that, beyond any other consideration, Saunders' work asks us to only emphasize, as this view strikes me as too apolitical and cut off from the possibility that empathetic readerly experiences might, in some cases, lead to pro-social action. For, as Victoria Smith argues, Knightwood is actually, quote, "a profoundly political work. For the effects of Barnes' experimental fiction, her public display of private loves and losses, are, paradoxically, recuperations of those losses," end quote. In the cases of both Barnes and Saunders, then, our willingness to accept their intimate narrations unironically and with feeling works to acknowledge their speakers' voices, privilege unheard perspectives, and thus bring them forth from the margins.